The Texas sun shows no mercy, and neither do men. For 17-year-old Abigail Finch, that truth was burned into her soul the day her own father-in-law, a man sworn to protect her, looked her in the eye and sold her. The price a single gleaming Spencer rifle. She was traded to a Comanche warrior, a man whose people her own had fought and feared for generations. She expected chains, a life of brutal servitude. But what he offered her was a promise whispered in a language she didn't understand, a promise of a love more powerful and dangerous than the wild frontier itself. The dust of the Llano Estacado had a taste. It was a gritty, relentless flavor that coated the tongue and settled deep in the lungs, a constant reminder of desolation. For Abigail Finch, it was the taste of despair. It had been 2 years since her pa had dragged their family from the green hills of Missouri to this forsaken scrap of West Texas, chasing a fool's dream of cattle and fortune. All they had found was drought, debt, and death. Her husband, young Thomas, had been taken by a fever 6 months prior, leaving her a widow at 17, bound to the grim charity of his father, Silas Finch. Silas was a hard man, his heart as barren as the land he tried to tame. His eyes, the color of faded denim, held no warmth, only a perpetual calculating squint against the sun and the world. He saw Abigail not as a daughter, but as another mouth to feed another burden in a life full of them. The day it happened began like any other. The sun rose in a blaze of orange and pink, a beautiful lie painting a sky over a land that offered none. Abigail was scrubbing the rough-spun clothes in a bucket of murky water, her knuckles raw when the riders appeared. They weren't soldiers or cowboys. They were Comanche. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through the small settlement of adobe walls. Doors slammed shut. Men scrambled for their rifles. But Silas Finch did not. He stood on the porch of his sodden timber hovel, his face a mask of grim resolve, and waited. There were 5 of them, their bodies lean and powerful, their skin the color of burnished copper. They rode with an easy grace that seemed to mock the clumsy efforts of the white settlers to conquer the land. The one who led them was different. He was younger than the others, perhaps 25, with a strong jaw and eyes so dark they seemed to swallow the light. A single eagle feather was tied in his long black hair. He carried himself with an unnerving stillness, an aura of authority that needed no announcement. He was Taveta, which in his tongue meant the sun. But the white men in their fear and ignorance called him Iron Sun. Abigail watched from the grimy window, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw Silas gesture his movements stiff and formal. One of the other settlers, a nervous man named Caleb Reed, tried to pull Silas back inside. "Are you mad, Finch? Bolt the door!" Silas shook him off. "Hold your tongue, Caleb. This is business." The business became horrifyingly clear. Taveta dismounted, his movements fluid and precise. He didn't speak English, nor Silas, the Numunu tongue. The transaction was conducted in a broken mix of Spanish and stark gestures. Taveta's gaze swept over the meager Finch homestead, dismissing the scrawny chickens and the half-starved cow. Then one of his men unslung a rifle from his horse. It wasn't just any rifle. It was a Spencer, repeating rifle, a weapon of almost mythical power on the frontier. It could fire 7 shots in as many seconds, a stark contrast to the so cumbersome muzzle loaders most settlers owned. To a man like Silas, constantly terrified of raids and desperate for an advantage, it was a treasure beyond price. His eyes, usually so dull, lit with a covetous fire. Taveta saw the look. A slow, deliberate negotiation began, a pantomime of value. Desire. Silas offered his last 2 barrels of flour, his only remaining horse, even the deed to his worthless plot of land. Taveta refused each offer with a simple, almost disdainful shake of his head. His dark eyes scanned the property again, and then they settled on the window where Abigail stood, frozen in terror. He pointed. A single, lean finger aimed directly at her. The air left Abigail's lungs. The world seemed to tilt and blur. She saw Silas hesitate, a flicker of something shamed out crossing his face. But it was fleeting, extinguished by the gleam of the rifle. Caleb Reed gasped, "Silas, no! For the love of God, tut man!" "You can't," but he could. Silas Finch looked from the magnificent weapon back to the terrified face of his son's widow. He saw not a girl he'd promised to care for, but a bargaining chip. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. The world shattered. Abigail didn't scream. The sound was trapped in her throat, a knot of pure, undiluted horror. She was dragged from the house by Silas himself, his fingers digging into her arm like talons. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. He shoved her forward into the dust, his final words to her a muttered justification to the horrified faces of his neighbors. "It's for the good of us all. For protection." Taveta handed the Spencer rifle to a stunned Silas. In return, one of his warriors took Abigail's arm. Her mind was a whirlwind of denial. This wasn't happening. It was a nightmare from which she would surely awake. But the grip on her arm was real. The acrid smell of horse and sweat was real. The triumphant glint in her father-in-law's eye as he clutched his new rifle was sickeningly real. She was lifted onto the back of a horse, seated in front of the warrior who had seized her. She risked one last look back. Silas was already inspecting the rifle's mechanism. His back turned to her, the ultimate betrayal. The other settlers stared, their faces a mixture of pity and fear. But no one moved. No one spoke. They were paralyzed by the audacity of the act and their own powerlessness. As the Comanche turned their horses to leave, Taveta rode close. He looked at her, and for the first time, his expression was not one of stoic command. There was something else in his dark eyes, something unreadable. He spoke, his voice low and resonant. The words were alien, a string of soft consonants and vowels that meant nothing to her. Yet the tone was not harsh. It was not the sound of a master claiming his property. It was something else entirely. She didn't know then that he had said, "You will not be a slave." All she knew was the dust rising from the horse's hooves, blotting out the sight of the only home she had, miserable as it was. All she knew was the crushing weight of being traded like livestock, her life bartered for a piece of polished wood and steel, chained not by iron, but by a transaction that had stripped her of her very humanity. The promise of love was a concept so foreign, so impossible in that moment, it didn't even exist in the universe of her despair. She was property, now heading into a world she could not comprehend under the ownership of a man they called Iron Sun. And the setting sun bleeding across the vast, indifferent sky felt like the end of the world. The journey was a blur of sun-scorched earth and suffocating fear. Abigail rode stiffly, her body aching from the unfamiliar posture, her mind numb with shock. The Comanche warrior she sat with, a man named Chaitin, meaning falcon, was a wall of silent muscle. He ignored her completely, his attention fixed on the endless horizon. They rode for what felt like days, the landscape shifting from the dusty plains to rolling hills dotted with scrub oak and mesquite. The world of the white man, with its straight lines and fenced-in ambitions, dissolved behind them, replaced by an untamed wilderness that felt both terrifying and strangely pure. Abigail expected cruelty. She had been raised on stories of Comanche brutality, tales told in hushed, fearful whispers around the campfire. She expected to be beaten, starved, and violated. But the cruelty she braced for never came. On the first evening when they made camp in a hidden arroyo, she was untied and given a piece of dried venison and a water skin. She watched her heart pounding as Taveta drank from his own water skin, only after ensuring she had drunk first. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it was the first crack in the wall of her terror. It made no sense. Why would a man who had traded for her show such a basic courtesy? She was his possession, his esclava. The Spanish word echoed in her mind, a brand seared onto her soul. Slaves were not given water first. The other warriors, Chaitan Nokona and Tohopka, largely ignored her. They spoke to each other in their flowing, musical language, their voices rising and falling with the crackle of the campfire. They treated her not with malice, but with a profound indifference. It was as if she were a ghost, a spectre they could see, but chose not to acknowledge. Only Taveta's eyes would occasionally meet hers across the flames. His gaze was intense, searching, but still unreadable. It was not the leering look of a captor, but something deeper, more complex. It unnerved her more than any threat. Her first test came on the third day. The sky, which had been a relentless sheet of blue, turned a bruised purple-gray. The air grew heavy and still. Taveta barked a sharp command, and the warriors began moving with urgent purpose, securing the horses and supplies. Abigail, understanding nothing but the sudden tension, simply stood useless and afraid. A fierce wind whipped through the canyon, carrying with it the first stinging drops of rain. A flash of lightning illuminated the sky, followed by a crack of thunder so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Panic seized her. She had a deep, primal fear of thunderstorms, a relic of a childhood incident where lightning had struck a tree just yards from her family's cabin. She squeezed her eyes shut, a small, involuntary whimper escaping her lips. Suddenly, a heavy weight settled over her shoulders. She gasped, her eyes flying open. It was Taveta. He had draped his own buffalo hide robe over her. The hide was warm from his body and smelled of smoke leather and the wild, clean scent of the plains. He stood before her, his body shielding her from the worst of the wind-driven rain. He said nothing, simply held her gaze as the storm raged around them. In that moment, her fear of the storm was eclipsed by a dizzying wave of confusion. This man, this savage who had bought her like a sack of grain, was protecting her. He was offering her his own comfort, his own protection from the elements. The gesture was so contrary to everything she believed, everything she had been taught, that her mind struggled to process it. She could feel the warmth of the robe seeping into her chilled skin, a strange and forbidden comfort. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and sage. Taveta took his robe back without a word and turned away to check on the horses. Abigail stood trembling not from the cold, but from the turmoil within her. The lines were blurring. He was her captor, the symbol of her degradation. Yet in his silent actions, he was treating her with more consideration than Silas Finch ever had. Their arrival at the main Comanche encampment a day later was the true beginning of her new life. Nestled in a wide, grassy valley, protected by high mesas, it was a sprawling village of dozens of tipis, their painted hides glowing in the afternoon sun. The air was filled with the sounds of live children laughing, dogs barking, the rhythmic thud of women tanning hides. If she had been invisible to the warriors on the trail, she was now the center of all attention. Faces peered from every teepee. Dark eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and from some, open hostility. Children pointed, and women whispered behind their hands. She was a tabaibo, a white person, an enemy. The weight of their collective gaze was suffocating. She felt her otherness like a physical cloak, heavy and suffocating. Taveta led his horse and Abigail by extension through the heart of the village. He did not lead her to a slave's pen or a work area. He stopped before one of the largest tepees, one decorated with paintings of suns and successful hunts. An older woman with a face like a beautiful wrinkled map and eyes that held the wisdom of ages emerged. This was Pia Taveta's mother. Pia's gaze was sharp and appraising. She looked Abigail up and down, taking in her torn, filthy dress, her matted blonde hair, and the terror in her blue eyes. She spoke to her son, her tone questioning, sharp. Taveta answered in a low, firm voice. Abigail couldn't understand the words, but she could hear the argument. Pia's eyes kept flicking to Abigail, and they held no welcome. She clearly did not approve of her son bringing a white woman into their camp, into their family's lodge. The argument ended when Taveta placed a hand gently on his mother's arm. He spoke one final, quiet sentence. Pia's expression softened almost imperceptibly. She sighed a long, weary sound, and then gestured for Abigail to enter the tipi. The inside was a revelation. Far from the crude shelters, she had imagined it was a spacious, orderly home. Buffalo robes covered the floor, and woven backrests provided comfort. The air was cool and smoky from a small central fire pit. It was a home, and she was an intruder in it. That night, Pia tossed a simple deerskin dress at her feet and pointed to a secluded spot. The unspoken command was clear change out of the filthy rags of your past. The deerskin was soft and supple against Abigail's skin. It felt strange, foreign, yet it was also clean and practical. When she emerged, Pia grunted a sound that could have been approval or dismissal and handed her a bowl of stew. Abigail ate in silence, acutely aware of the two people watching her. Taveta sat across the fire, cleaning the mechanism of a pistol, his movements economical and precise. Pia sat working a piece of leather with an awl. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken questions and simmering tensions. Later, when it was time to sleep, Pia pointed to a pile of robes on one side of the teepee. Taveta's sleeping robes were on the opposite side. A clear, unspoken boundary had been drawn. There was no suggestion of forced intimacy, no hint that he would claim the rights her purchase implied. He simply lay down on his own robes, wrapped himself in a blanket, and closed his eyes. Abigail lay awake for hours, her mind racing. She had been traded for a rifle. She was a captive. But she was not in chains. She was not being beaten or starved. Her captor had shielded her from a storm, and now slept on the other side of a fire from her, affording her a respect she could not comprehend. He had promised her something with his eyes, with his actions, a language she was only just beginning to learn. The horror of her sale remained a raw wound, but for the first time, a tiny, fragile seed of a new emotion began to sprout in the barren soil of her despair-confusion. Who was this man, Teveta? And what did he truly want from her? The first few weeks in the Comanche camp were a crucible of adaptation. Abigail, renamed Tichinob, meaning one who stays, by Pia, was plunged into a world where every rule she had ever known was obsolete. Her days were no longer measured by the chiming of a clock she didn't own, but by the movement of the sun and the rhythm of the camp's needs. Pia became her reluctant tutor. She was a stern and demanding teacher, communicating through sharp gestures and exasperated sighs. Abigail learned to scrape hides until her arms ached to gather a dozen different kinds of roots and berries, to sew with a bone needle and sinew thread, and to distinguish the calls of different birds. Every task was a lesson in survival, a skill in a world that did not suffer fools or the weak. The work was hard, far harder than the drudgery on Silas's homestead. But it was different. It was work with purpose. She could see the direct result of her labor in the food they ate, the clothes they wore, and the shelter that kept them warm. There was no kindness in Pia's instruction, but there was a grudging respect that grew with each task Abigail mastered. The first time Abigail successfully started a fire with a fire drill, Pia watched her with narrowed eyes and gave a single curt nod. For Abigail, it felt like winning a medal. Teveta remained a distant, enigmatic presence. He was a war chief, a man of great importance in the band. He would be gone for days at a time, leading hunting parties or patrols. When he was in the village, he was often in council with the elders or training the young warriors. He rarely spoke to Abigail directly, yet his presence was a constant, unspoken force in her life. She would feel his eyes on her as she worked, a steady, watchful gaze that made her hands tremble. He never offered to help with her woman's work. That was not his place, but he would leave a brace of plump rabbits near the teepee. After a hunt, a silent contribution. The animosity from others in the camp was a persistent threat. A warrior named Mokoso, meaning bearded one, for his unusually thick facial hair, was particularly hostile. He had lost family in a cavalry raid, and saw in Abigail's blue eyes and pale hair the face of all his enemies. He would taunt her in the Numanu tongue, words she didn't understand, but whose venomous tone was unmistakable. He would kick dust on the hides she was cleaning, or deliberately poke the horse she was trying to water. One afternoon, as Abigail was returning from the creek with 2 heavy water skins, Mokoso blocked her path. He stood with 2 of his friends, his face twisted in a sneer. He said something sharp and insulting, and then he lunged, not at her, but at the water skins. He knocked them from her hands, and the precious water which she had carried for half a mile under the hot sun soaked into the thirsty ground. Tears of frustration and anger welled in Abigail's eyes. She had worked too hard for this. Without thinking, she spun on him. Her voice choked with rage. "Leave me alone!" she cried out in English. Mokoso, surprised by her defiance, laughed. He took a menacing step closer, raising his hand. Before he could move further, a hand like a steel band clamped down on his shoulder. It was Teveta. He had appeared as if from nowhere, silent as a shadow. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes blazing with a cold fire that made Mokoso visibly flinch. Teveta spoke his voice dangerously low, almost a growl. It was a short, sharp sentence. Mokoso's bravado evaporated instantly. He stared at Teveta, his eyes wide with a fear that bordered on reverence. He mumbled an apology, his gaze fixed on the ground, and then he and his friends practically scrambled to get away. Teveta turned to Abigail. The fury in his eyes softened as he looked at her, replaced by that same unreadable, intense expression. He gestured to the empty water skins on the ground, then pointed back towards the creek. He turned and began to walk. The message was clear. "We will get the water again." Abigail hesitated for only a second before grabbing the skins and following him. They walked in silence. When they reached the creek, Taveta took one of the heavy skins from her and filled it himself. As they walked back to the camp, he slowed his long strides to match her shorter ones. It was another small act, another confusing piece of the puzzle. He had not only defended her, he had humbled a fellow warrior to do so. And now he was sharing her burden. This incident marked a turning point. The open hostility from the others didn't vanish, but it became more subdued. More. The word spread quickly. The white woman was under Taveta's personal and absolute protection. To insult her was to insult him, and no one was foolish enough to do that. But protection came at a price. Abigail was now inextricably linked to him in the eyes of the entire tribe. She was Taveta's white woman. The whispers that followed her now were not just of hate, but of speculation. Why did the great war chief protect her so fiercely? He had taken no other wife. He showed no interest in the young Comanche women who watched him with admiring eyes. Why her? The answer to that question was a ghost from Taveta's own past, a story Abigail could not have known. Years before, when he was just a boy, his younger sister Topasana had been captured by white traders. They had found her body weeks later left in a canyon. The trauma of that loss and the consuming guilt of not having been able to protect her had forged the man he was. In Abigail, in her fear and her vulnerability, he saw an echo of his lost sister. His determination to protect her was not born of love for a woman. Not yet, but of a fierce, desperate need to atone for a past failure. His promise of love, not chains, was a vow to his sister's memory as much as it was a promise to Abigail. This truth remained locked in his heart, a silent driving force behind his actions. Abigail, knowing none of it, saw only the paradox of her situation. She was a captive who was fiercely protected, a slave who was granted respect, an outsider who was being slowly, inexorably woven into the fabric of the tribe through the actions of one man. One evening, a new arrival threw the camp into a state of excitement. A group of Comancheros, the shadowy New Mexican traders who operated between the worlds of the white man and the Comanche, rode in with mules laden with goods. They brought iron pots, tobacco, colorful blankets, and most importantly, whiskey. Their leader was a man named Joaquin Cortez, a suave, silver-tongued trader with a thin mustache and eyes that missed nothing. He spoke fluent Numunu Spanish and English, and his easy charm was a dangerous mask for a ruthless soul. His gaze lingered on Abigail as she helped Pia prepare the evening meal. Later that night, as the whiskey flowed and the trading grew loud, Cortez approached Taveta's tipi. He was invited in a courtesy extended to a trading partner. He sat by the fire, his eyes glinting with avarice. "The war chief has a new prize," Cortez said in Spanish, nodding towards Abigail. "A fine-looking woman. Blonde hair is rare. Men in Santa Fe would pay a great price for such a novelty. $200 silver, maybe more." Abigail, who had picked up enough Spanish from the settlers to understand, felt a chill run down her spine. She was being appraised again, her value calculated in cold, hard currency. Taveta did not look up from the arrow he was fletching. His hands remained perfectly steady. "She is not for sale," he said, his Spanish as crisp and clear as Cortez's. Cortez chuckled a greasy sound. "Everything is for sale, my friend, for the right price. I have repeating rifles more than you can carry. I have ammunition. I can make you the most powerful chief on the plains." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Just for the girl." Abigail held her breath. This was the ultimate test. Silas Finch had sold her for one rifle. Joaquin Cortez was offering a small arsenal. She watched Tavetta's face, searching for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of the same covetous greed she had seen in her father-in-law's eyes. Taveta slowly set down his arrow. He lifted his head, and his dark eyes met Cortez's. The easy warmth was gone from his face, replaced by a coldness that was more terrifying than any open rage. "You have eaten my food and sat by my fire." Taveta said, his voice low and deadly. "So I will allow you to leave this lodge with your life. But if you ever speak of her again, if you ever look at her again, I will cut out your tongue and feed it to the dogs. Now get out." The threat was delivered with such chilling finality that even the air in the teepee seemed to grow cold. Joaquin Cortez, for all his bravado, went pale. He saw in Taveta's eyes not a man making a bargain, but a man defending something sacred. He scrambled to his feet, bowed awkwardly, and fled the tipi. Abigail let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Her heart was pounding a frantic drum against her ribs. He had been offered wealth and power for her, and he had refused without a moment's hesitation. He had defended her not as property, but as something inviolable. Later, after Pia was asleep, Taveta looked across the fire at her. The silence stretched thick with unspoken meaning. He finally spoke, his voice soft, almost gentle. He used the few English words he had begun to learn, piecing them together carefully. "You, not for sale." Then he added a Numanu word she had come to know. Nurmaro. It meant my people or my family. But the way he said it, the way he looked at her, it felt like he meant something more. He meant mine. Not as a possession, but as a person who belonged with him. That night, Abigail cried for the first time since she had been taken. They were not tears of terror or despair. They were tears of profound, heart-wrenching confusion. The chains she had imagined were nowhere to be found. Instead, she was being bound by something far more complex and powerful. A debt of protection, a thread of respect, and the dawning, terrifying possibility that the promise whispered on the day of her sale might not have been a lie. The fragile peace of the passing weeks was a balm on Abigail's soul. The raw terror that had defined her first days among the Numunu had slowly scabbed over, replaced by the quiet purpose of routine. She was Tichy-Nob now, a name that felt less like a label and more like a budding identity. The rhythms of the camp were becoming her own, dictated not by a merciless clock on a mantle, but by the arc of the sun and the fundamental needs of life. Her hands, once soft and prone to blistering, were now calloused and capable. She learned to read the subtle language of the plains, the way a shift in the wind could foretell rain, how the frantic chatter of prairie dogs could signal a distant rider. Under Pia's stern, unsmiling tutelage, she mastered tasks she would have once thought impossible. She could now flesh a deer hide with a scraper made from bone, her movements rhythmic and efficient. She knew which roots to dig for a nourishing stew and which bright red berries held only poison. Her greatest triumph had come just a week before, when she had successfully traded a small, neatly sewn pouch she'd made for a string of turquoise beads from another woman conducting the entire transaction in broken, halting numunu. The woman had smiled a genuine, unguarded smile, and for a fleeting moment, Abigail had felt not like a captive, but a neighbor. Her relationship with Taveta remained a landscape of vast, unspoken distances. He was the sun that warmed the valley, a presence felt even when unseen. He was gone for days on patrol or leading hunts, and when he returned, a quiet energy settled over the teepee. In the evenings, she would watch him from across the central fire. He would meticulously repair his weapons or work tallow into his saddle, his large hands moving with a surprising gentle precision. He never spoke of his excursions, but sometimes when he thought she was not looking, she would catch him watching her. His dark eyes filled with a brooding intensity that was neither threatening nor possessive, but something far more complex. It was a gaze that seemed to be constantly measuring, questioning, and perhaps protecting. The space between their sleeping robes on opposite sides of the teepee remained sacrosanct, an invisible line of respect he never crossed. The promise of love he had supposedly made was not in words or touches, but in this profound, unwavering respect. It was a foundation being laid stone by silent stone, and she was beginning to find her footing upon it. This delicate world built on unspoken understandings and the slow growth of trust was shattered by the thunder of a single horse. He came from the north, a rider from the antelope band, his face a mask of dust and dread. The horse under him was a testament to the urgency of his message, its sides heaving, its legs trembling foam and sweat, turning its coat to a dark paste. The man, a warrior named Pahayoko, nearly fell from the saddle as he reined to a halt in the center of the village. "Rangers," he gasped the word, a ragged croak. "The long knives are coming." The news ripped through the camp like a prairie fire. The cheerful sounds of the afternoon vanished, replaced by a sudden electric silence. Women froze, clutching their children closer. The old men who had been dozing in the sun straightened their faces instantly grim. Taveta emerged from the council lodge, his expression hardening as he listened to Pahayoko's desperate report. It wasn't just a patrol. It was a company, more than 100 strong, armed with Colt revolvers and brand-new carbines. And they were led by a man whose name was spoken like a plague, Captain Elias Thorne. Pahayoko, choked out, had just fallen upon a peaceful hunting camp of the Kiowa. He and his men had not offered a battle. They had delivered a massacre. They had killed warriors, women and children without distinction, leaving their bodies for the vultures as a message. And their next destination, according to a scout who had barely escaped, was this very valley. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, coiled in Abigail's stomach. She was a white woman. These rangers were her people, her countrymen. But the name Elias Thorne conjured no image of heroism. It conjured only the vision of Silas Finch's greedy eyes of men who saw others as obstacles or objects. She looked at Pia, who was now standing beside her, her face carved from stone, her knuckles white where she gripped her scraping tool. She looked at the young boys no older than 15, rushing to fetch their bows, their faces a volatile mixture of terror and a desperate need to prove their manhood. These were not the faceless savages of the stories she'd been told her whole life. They were a people, her people now in a way she could never have foreseen, and Elias Thorne was coming to erase them. The War Council convened immediately. The air inside the large lodge was thick with the smell of smoke, sweat, and fear. Abigail stood outside, straining to hear the passionate flow of voices within. She heard the voice of Nokona, usually so steady, raised in a plea for caution, arguing that they should flee east into the Badlands, where the rangers' horses could not follow. Then she heard Taveta's voice. It was not loud, but it cut through the others with a calm, resonant authority that commanded silence. He would not run. To run was to invite pursuit, to allow Thorn to chase them down on open ground and butcher them as he had the Kiowa. To run was to surrender their home, their ancestral lands, to a man who saw them as vermin. No, they would not run. They would fight, but they would fight on Numunu ground by Numunu rules. He spoke of a place to the north, a narrow, winding canyon of rock and shadow, a place the white men called Diablo's Moor. It was a natural fortress, a killing ground where a few could hold off many, where the rangers' rifles would be answered by arrows from 100 hidden ledges. When he emerged, his decision was written on his face. He moved with a lethal purpose, directing the warriors. War paint, black for strength, red for blood, was mixed. Lances were sharpened, bowstrings tested. A low, solemn chant began to rise from the warriors, a sound that vibrated deep in Abigail's chest. It was a song of courage, a prayer to the spirits of the earth and sky, a farewell to the living world. As the chosen party of 50 warriors prepared their horses, Taveta found her. She was frantically helping Pia pack pemmican and dried berries into leather satchels, her hands trembling so badly she could barely tie the knots. "Titchy knob," he said, his voice cutting through her panic. She looked up at him. He was transformed. Stripped to his breechcloth, his chest and face were covered in the stark patterns of war paint. He seemed taller, fiercer, a primal force of nature. "You will go with Pia," he stated, his new English still clipped and precise. "And the others. Go south. Follow the Cimarron River until you reach the Standing Stones. Do not stop. You will wait for us there." "You are going to fight them," she breathed the words, catching in her throat. He gave a single, sharp nod. His gaze was fixed on her, but his eyes seemed to see the bloody work that lay ahead. "It is our way. We do not give our homes to monsters." A wave of desperation washed over her. The thought of him riding into that canyon, facing the rifles of 100 men, was a physical pain. "Don't go," she whispered, knowing how foolish and selfish the words were. "Please, just come with us." "To live as a rabbit, always running?" he asked, a flicker of sorrow in his eyes. "That is not life. That is a slow death. It is better to die as a wolf defending its own." He looked at her, then at the terror plain on her face, and his expression softened. "I must do this. To protect Pia. To protect the children." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "To protect you." Before she could process his words, before she could breathe, he reached out. It was not a gesture of command or restraint. His large, calloused hand came up, and he gently, so gently, brushed a stray lock of blonde hair from her cheek. The touch was feather light, a ghost of a caress, yet it sent a bolt of lightning through her entire being. The calloused warrior, the fearsome war chief, had touched her with the tenderness one might use on a fragile flower. It was the most intimate gesture she had ever known. "I will return, Titchy-Knob," he said, his voice a low vow. "I promise you." He held her gaze for one heartbeat longer, a universe of unspoken emotion passing between them. Then he turned, swung himself onto his stallion's back, and with a sharp cry led his warriors out of the camp and toward Diablo's moor. The exodus south was a grim, forced march. The sounds of weeping children, the groaning of the heavy travois poles dragging on the earth, and the constant anxious whispers of the women formed a symphony of sorrow. Abigail pulled alongside Pia, her shoulder pressed to the travois, her muscles screaming in protest. The distant rhythmic pop, 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 pop of gunfire began to drift toward them on the afternoon wind. Each faint sound was a hammer blow to her heart. With every crackle, she pictured Tveta. She imagined him behind a rock, the painted fury on his face, an arrow nocked on his bow. She imagined the chaos, the smoke, the screams. Pia, sensing her spiraling terror, paused and put a steady hand on her arm. "Do not fill your heart with ghosts," the old woman said, her voice raspy but firm. "My son's spirit is strong. He was born in a storm. He will not be broken by a little wind." She looked Abigail in the eye, a deep, knowing look. "He made you a promise. Tveta does not break his promises." 2 agonizing days later they reached the Standing Stones, a cluster of ancient monoliths in the Cimarron Basin. They made a cold, fireless camp, the mood bleak and heavy with dread. A scout was sent back north. The hours he was gone were the longest of Abigail's life. When he finally returned, his news was a double-edged sword. The battle was over. The Rangers were broken, retreating in disarray. Captain Thorne had been soundly defeated, his arrogance costing him dearly. A cheer went up from some of the women, a sound of pure relief. But the scout held up a hand, his face grim. The victory, he said, was bathed in blood. Many warriors would not be returning. Many more were badly wounded. The cheer died in the air. A new, more personal wave of fear washed over the camp. Abigail's eyes were fixed on the northern trail, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She began to pray, not to the God of her childhood, who felt 1,000,000 miles away, but to the vast, indifferent ski, to the spirit of the plains, to anything that might be listening. The survivors began to trickle in singly and in small groups. They were a portrait of battle's brutal cost. Men limped, supported by their friends. Their faces were smeared with blood and grime, their eyes holding a haunted, distant look. Abigail and Pia stood together, a silent, terrified vigil, scanning each new arrival. She saw Chaitan, his left arm bound tightly to his chest in a crude sling, his face pale but resolute. She saw Nokona, a bloody gash across his thigh, being helped from his horse. With each warrior that returned without Tveta, the knot of panic in Abigail's stomach twisted tighter. The sun began to bleed across the horizon, painting the clouds in hues of orange and blood. Hope dwindled with the fading light. Pia stood like a carved statue, but a single tear traced a path through the deep wrinkles on her cheek. The promise was broken. The wolf had fallen. Then on the highest point of the ridge, silhouetted against the dying sun, 2 horses appeared. One was Tveta's magnificent stallion, the other a rangy horse with a U.S. Army brand. Slumped over his stallion's neck, held in place by the warrior leading his horse, was Tveta. "He's alive." The cry tore from Abigail's throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. She ran, stumbling over rocks and brush, her only thought to get to him. They brought him into the teepee and laid him gently upon his robes. He was unconscious, his face a ghastly ashen grey. A thick, hastily applied bandage around his ribs was soaked through with dark arterial blood. A ranger's bullet had torn through his side, a ragged, ugly wound. Pia became a figure of focused intensity. Her maternal grief was walled off behind a lifetime of medicinal knowledge. She barked orders, sending women scurrying for fresh water moss to pack the wound and the specific herbs she needed. With hands that were surprisingly steady, she cut away the bandage and began to clean the wound. Abigail stood by, paralyzed by a crushing sense of helplessness. She could scrape hides and find roots, but she knew nothing of healing a man from the brink of death. She was an outsider once more, a useless observer in this fight for his life. The fever set in by midnight. It came on him like a predator, shaking his strong body with violent tremors. He began to thrash in a tormented delirium, his voice a low moan. He cried out in Numunu, reliving the battle, his hands clenching at unseen enemies. Then he cried out a name that sent a chill through Abigail, despite the heat radiating from his body. Topazana! He choked out his voice, filled with an anguish so profound it was terrifying. Topazana, I am sorry. Pia, who had been stoically applying a poultice, flinched as if struck. Her iron control finally shattered. Sobs racked her ancient frame as she tried to soothe him, murmuring his name, her tears falling onto his feverish skin. Watching her grief, watching the life flicker in the man who had saved her, something inside Abigail broke. The helplessness transformed into a fierce, unyielding resolve. She knelt on the other side of his robes, gently taking the damp cloth from Pia's trembling hands. "Let me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Rest. I will watch him." Pia looked up, her dark eyes swimming with tears. She saw not a white captive, but another woman desperate to save the man they both cherished. She gave a slow, exhausted nod and allowed Abigail to take over. For 3 days and 3 nights, Abigail did not leave his side. She lived in a waking dream of exhaustion and fear. The teepee became her entire world, filled with the scent of Herb's blood and the ever-present heat of the fever. She learned to clean the angry, weeping wound. She learned to force spoonfuls of broth and bitter medicinal tea past his clenched teeth. She bathed his burning skin, her own body aching with fatigue. And she talked to him. In the long, silent hours of the night, with only the sound of his ragged breathing for company, she spoke to him in a low, constant murmur. She told him of the green hills of Missouri, of catching fireflies in a jar, of the smell of her mother's baking bread. She poured out the memories of her old life, offering them as a lifeline to pull him back from the shadowy world where he wandered. In that intimate, desperate vigil, as she fought for every breath he took, the last of her confusion burned away in the fire of his fever. The gratitude she felt for him, the respect she held for him, the fear she had for him. She finally recognized it for what it was. It was love, a fierce, terrifying, and absolute love for the man her people would call an enemy. She loved him for the honor he showed, for the protection he gave, for the silent promise he kept, even now fighting for every inch of life. The man who had bought her for a rifle had claimed her soul not by force, but by a quiet nobility she had never known. On the 4th morning, the air in the teepee felt different. It was cool and still. The fever had broken. Abigail slumped against a backrest. Her head, nodding with exhaustion, was startled awake by a subtle shift. Taveta's thrashing had ceased. His breathing was deep and even. His eyes fluttered open. The delirium was gone. They were clear, lucid, and they were fixed on her. His gaze moved from her weary face down to his bandaged side, then back to her. A flicker of understanding crossed his features. His hand, weak but steady, moved across the buffalo robe and came to rest over hers. The simple warmth of his skin was the most profound sensation she had ever felt. "Titchy knob," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He used her Comanche name, the name that meant one who stays. And in the way he said it, in the deep, unwavering look in his eyes, she knew. She had stayed, and she was home. And so their story was not one of a captor and his captive, but of two souls from warring worlds, finding sanctuary in each other's care. But the frontier is relentless, and peace is a fragile thing. Captain Thorne is not a man to accept defeat, and the shadow of the past, both his and hers, is long. Their love, forged in fire and blood, will face trials they cannot yet imagine. If you were captivated by the story of Abigail and Taveta, please show your support. Hit that like button. Let me know your favorite part in the comments. And be sure to share this video with anyone who loves a powerful story of the Old West. Most importantly, subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter in this Wild West drama. We have so much more of their journey to tell. Thank you for listening.